I want to introduce this first sort of lecture series, in a way, a public lecture series that is trying to construct or build around the direction that the new school is right now trying to push through the new graduate programs right now that we're starting in September of this year. One is called the Masters in Design Urban Ecologies, and the other one is a Theories of Urban Practice, which are very close programs that are working and trying to look at conditions of political and social engagement towards urban transformation, more oriented into the constitution construction and operation within the other city that is not normally addressed by capital as such. In this series, what we try to do is actually construct something that started to mirror a little bit the direction that we're taking for these programs, and so far it has been really an amazing series to be part of. This time I have really the pleasure of introducing Andrew Ross. Andrew is a professor in NYU, sociologist, but I guess sociologist doesn't do him justice. Those who know his work and have read his texts are clearly versed in many directions and transdisciplinary frames that not normally touch sociology in the traditional form, but that bring sociology and a very different type of advocacy into the urban in a form of very committed activism. Andrew, well, I met Andrew not long ago. It was during an Occupy meeting that Andrew was starting to organize one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most well-led committees within that the movement has engendered, which is the Committee on Student Debt. Andrew is, for me, one of these great exceptions within academia, which is a person that is not only incredibly relevant, but by many times he's been considered one of the most important intellectuals living today, but that his intellectual activity gets pushed into the frame of the activist. It's very difficult to find such a distinguished academic, respected academic, that inserts itself as much into the ground, into the war, into the real issues than Andrew. I think Andrew really represents that sort of paradigm that perhaps Bourdieu always was complaining about the homo academicus, that person that always stayed and wrote from their office. And Andrew really represents the opposite of this. So it's an incredible pleasure to have you here. In his recent book, among many of his writings, he started to work around the issue of sustainability with a very particular point of view, and very interesting point of view, focused on the work on Phoenix, Arizona, that the title of his book addresses as the world's most unsustainable city. Andrew is going to be talking about that today, and I hope we have a little conversation afterwards on his talk. So Andrew, thank you very much, and welcome. Really, it's a pleasure. Oh, I just laughed. Sorry. I should have.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for that introduction. So embarrassing to me.
I always try to do that, yeah, to embarrass a little bit.
Thank you, anyway. Thanks for coming out this evening. So I'm going to be talking about urban sustainability, and perhaps you've noticed that climate activists and public officials keep coming back from these big UN climate summits in a very deep funk about government inaction. And even if the political obstacles to carbon policy making were to disappear overnight, a lot of thoughtful people have concluded it may already be too late to do anything to avert drastic climate change. Better to adapt to foreseeable futures worst case scenarios, and try to anticipate them. There are others who favor the quickest forms of carbon emissions possible, quickest reduction of carbon emissions possible by any means necessary, even if it means following along undemocratic pathways. James Lovelock, the eminent ecologist, recently declared that it may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while until we can take adequate action to avert climate change. And this belief that civil liberties can and should be suspended until adequate action can be taken certainly has its advocates, especially among folks who are promoting very top-down geoengineering schemes to alter the world's energy balance, like seeding the oceans with iron and so on and so forth. And for sure, anything's worth considering if we are to win the race to decarbonization. But not, I think, if it's going to put us on some kind of authoritarian death march, because I think we should be clear about one thing: the failure to confront the climate crisis is not a failure of democracy. It is a result of the stranglehold on democracy of fossil fuel capitalism. Now, for those of you who are allergic to despair, and I hope there's some of you in the audience this evening, thank you. I would include myself among that number. For those of us, where do we look for evidence that progress is being made? And the answer is to cities. Cities are, today, there's a thriving sustainable cities movement in all of the developed countries and in many developing countries around the world. City mayors toot their horns whenever their cities move up in the sustainability rankings. And there's even a race afoot right now to claim the mantle of America's greenest city. Why cities? Well, unlike state and federal lawmakers who tend to rule on energy policy and energy regulation, city halls are generally not in that position, so they're not subject to the fierce lobbying of the fossil industries, and therefore they're generally more free to push green policies. And the other thing to bear in mind is that cities certainly are on the front line in this struggle. They emit 80% of the world's carbon emissions, and it's only really in dense urban environments that low carbon living is possible on a mass scale. But I think and this is one of the arguments I'm going to be making this evening, if city halls' sustainability plans are targeted only to populations that can afford the lifestyles, sustainable lifestyles, then these plans will be part of the problem and not part of the solution. They will further contribute to a social geography that is already evident in many of our cities that can be loosely described as eco-apartheid. It's a term that was introduced by Van Jones, who was a short-lived green job czar in the Obama administration. And it's a provocative term, but I find it quite useful. What does it mean? Increasingly, we're seeing how neoliberal investment patterns, consumer niche marketing, and government policies that are favored by moneyed voters are succeeding in creating showpiece pockets of green living in our big cities. But these oases, these eco-oases, are increasingly coexisting with human and natural sacrifice zones on the other side of the tracks, as it were, where populations are still fighting to breathe clean air and drink uncontaminated water. Now, if you read the literature on urban sustainability, you'll find there's an awful lot about environmental showpieces, like Portland, or Curitiba, or Reykjavik, or Freiburg, or even Singapore. And the success of these cities in reaching their sustainability goals has been much emulated. More vulnerable or more recalcitrant places have other lessons to teach us, lessons about how we make green policy decisions, or whether we even have the wherewithal to make the right ones. And that's why I chose to do my research and write this last book of mine in Metro Phoenix, the struggle of Metro Phoenix to become a resilient metropolis. It's faced with much larger environmental challenges and considerably more resistance from its elected officials than havens of green consciousness like Seattle or San Francisco. But I think that's the reason that Phoenix may prove to be a more useful bellwether of sustainability. If Phoenix can become sustainable, then it can be done anywhere. I mean, that was basically the premise that drove my research and my investigations in the metropolis. More than any other US metropolis, Phoenix has channeled the national appetite for unrestrained growth in the post-war years. And we know that that American habit of growth is consuming a vastly disproportionate share of the Earth's resources, including its carbon allotment. So if there's any chance of altering that pattern significantly, then some of the results are going to have to show up in places like this, the 1,000 square miles of urban sprawl in central Arizona. The challenges are quite formidable. Less than 7 inches of rain annually. Its most dependable water supplies are pumped 300 miles uphill from the over-allocated and drought-beset flow of the Colorado River. The region is deluged with over 330 days of bright sunshine, but only a tiny percentage of that of its energy is drawn from solar sources, much less than New Jersey, for example, which is kind of shameful. From 1990 to 2007, Arizona increased its carbon emissions faster than any other American state, at a rate more than 3 times the national average. And although Phoenix was once a haven for TB sufferers seeking respiratory relief, by the turn of the millennium, the city was drawing the lowest grades from the National Lung Association in air quality in both ozone and particulates. And of all U.S. cities, Phoenix flew the highest in the race to profit from the housing bubble, and it's fallen the furthest, perhaps with the exception of Las Vegas, as a result of the speculator-induced land crash. Population growth is the only real driver of the economy. As one of my informants put it to me, it's people who are building homes for people who are building homes. It's the basic formula for economic growth and subsistence in the region. And that core industry of land development, of course, fell off a cliff a few years ago and is far, far from recovery. And last of all, the city already boasts the hottest summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere, and it is actually in the bullseye of climate change in the hemisphere. It's predicted to heat up and dry out faster than any other region. And last summer's August was particularly notable in that regard. It was so hot that even the scorpions were staying out of the sun, and resulted in a notable spike in indoor stings. This is a picture, you've heard all about tumbleweed subdivisions. This is an image from one of those tumbleweed subdivisions on the urban fringe. It's in the West Valley in Phoenix, and so you can see all the roads have been laid and on all the signage, and it's quite possible no one will ever live here. The desert has begun to reclaim this subdivision, the latest ghost town of the far west in many ways. So even after decades of lavish federal spending on public works and water infrastructure, after decades of lavish defense industry payrolls that underpinned the rise of the Sun Belt in the Cold War years, often called the Gun Belt. Even with all of this government assistance, the stark vulnerability of Phoenix's Sonoran Desert habitat makes it a very questionable location for 4 million people to be living currently, and certainly for the 9 million people whom the land development industry would like to see living in the megapolitan region, which is given the name the Sun Corridor and is slated to run from Phoenix to Tucson in the decades to come. Actually, from Prescott to Tucson, even further. That said, many of the world's fastest growing cities are also in semi-arid regions. And so as climate change intensifies, they may well share the same destiny as Metro Phoenix. And so, my working assumption was that the lessons to be learned or extracted from central Arizona may well turn out to be applicable in other parts of the world, but especially in the swelling megacities of Africa and the Middle East and Asia. A few words about methodology. What methodologies do you adopt if you're trying to study the sustainability of a sprawling metro region? By no means obvious. I myself have written several book-length ethnographies, but they tended to be studies of relatively bounded communities, a small town in Florida, new media company in New York City, a skilled labor market in East China. Metro Phoenix is a much tougher nut to crack. But after completing some preliminary research, I decided that what I would do would be to target and interview 200 of the city's more thoughtful, influential, and active citizens about the region's prospects for becoming sustainable. I aimed for very broad coverage, so I cast a very wide net, and I'll just list some of the occupational sectors where I did interviews with state and city lawmakers, government professionals in urban planning and economic development, real estate brokers and attorneys, policy analysts, land developers and home builders, nonprofit operatives, small business owners, civil rights champions, energy lobbyists, solar entrepreneurs, engineers and technicians, utility regulators, industrial ecologists, banking economists, artists, curators and gallerists, community activists, affordable housing providers, land trust officials, opinion journalists, urban farmers, archaeologists, tribal activists and officials, green business advocates, environmental justice watchdogs, trade unionists, university administrators, and also a variety of scholars in the sustainability field. ASU in neighboring Tempe has been sort of restructured in the last decade and is a center for sustainability studies now. So the idea was I would combine my interviewees' experience and knowledge of the metropolis with my own assessment of the strength and quality of the appetite for change, and the result was supposed to be this composite picture of the region's potentials for a greener future, along with the many obstacles that lay in its path. And diagnosing the obstacles was just as important as anything else, because that's where a lot of the lessons lay. So from a methodological perspective, what I was doing, what I found was that qualitative ethnography offered an alternative to the over-reliance on quantitative indicators or quantitative data that tends to dominate the sustainability field. For example, the sustainability indicators that city officials tend to use to rate their performances, which is, you know, part and parcel of the culture of urban management these days. These are indicators that conform to managerial norms of measurement because they're made up of very easily quantifiable items. Like this year, we had more solar roofs and less airborne particulates. We had more transit riders, we had less water use per capita, more housing density, less golf courses, and so on and so forth. Metrics like these convey a purely physical sense of how cities can be greened, suggesting that the ecological crisis can somehow be fixed by making slight technical adjustments to people's daily interactions with the environment. By contrast, there are no metrics, there are no indexes for measuring social sustainability, environmental justice, and so on and so forth. And yet, among the findings of my research was that the keys to urban sustainability lie less in physical or technical fixes than in aspects of social cooperation, such as whether communities can learn how to renounce self-interested hoarding and practice mutual aid, whether the wealth provision can respond to the environmental claims of the poor by strengthening democratic inclusion, whether they can promote access and participation for populations who are habitually ignored either by the green marketing of the private sector or by the sustainability green city campaigning of City Hall. Or indeed, with respect to City Hall, whether officials can accept the risk values of the most vulnerable populations in the city as a baseline for formulating green policy making. These are all elements of what you could call social character, and it's not easy to measure them. Trying to measure them really is like counting grains of sand with a fork. So on issue after issue, I found that Phoenix was a textbook example of what I would call deficits in equity, and that under those circumstances, City Hall's efforts at green governance would be primarily a recipe for managing inequalities rather than correcting inequalities. The most obvious example was the distribution of pollution hazards in Phoenix, which, as in most US cities, show a long-standing pattern of burden loaded against Indian reservations or poor neighborhoods dominated by minority populations. Communities that have been treated as dumping grounds for waste disposal and noxious industry really are a world apart from populations who can afford the aromatic desert breezes and mountain preserves of some of the northern sections of Metro Phoenix. This is a map of the Phoenix Basin, and the reason why Phoenix is there is because they're basically in the middle of the desert. Is that there are 3 rivers whose watersheds drain into the Phoenix Basin. The Salt River along here, the Gila River here, and the Agua Verde over there. And the Phoenix Basin was the site or the location of a pre-Columbian water irrigation civilization called the Hohokam. And Phoenix is built on top of the remains of the Hohokam, who became archaeologically invisible in the 1400s. I don't know of another major American city that is built on the ruins of a civilization. And there's an allegory to that. So topographically, the geography tilts up towards the mountain preserves, and so it's in these northern areas, Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, and northern Phoenix, that the more affluent populations live. The lower income populations live down here in the old floodplains of the Salt River. And there's nothing sustainable in the long run about one population living the green American dream up here, while across town another one is trapped in pestilence. The low-lying geography of South Phoenix here hosts one of the dirtiest zip codes in America, and is also home to 40% of the city's hazardous industrial emissions. Another relevant story is the inner ring suburbs of the Cold War era, which are basically here in West Phoenix and East Phoenix. And today, these were the suburbs that hosted the defense industries, the Cold War defense industries that were channeled into the Phoenix region. And they're now saddled with the poisonous legacy of those defense industries, some of the worst groundwater contamination in the nation. This is a map of some of the contamination plumes in the aquifers beneath Phoenix, and the map is compiled by data that's available from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, whose job basically has been to protect the polluters as much as anything else. And so the data is probably very conservative. But they only make available data for single sites of contamination. They don't provide a composite map of the whole urban area. So that's what I put together, or my research assistant put this map together. Just to give you some idea of the extent of this central plume that runs through downtown Phoenix is more than 15 miles long. It's not far below the surface. And most people living or working in those areas are unaware of this, the poison that is flowing slowly beneath their feet. Certainly most recent, some of the more recent arrivals in the last 20 or 30 years or so would be unaware of this. And the poison doesn't just stay under there. One of the things the EPA is increasingly focused on is something called vapor intrusion, which is when volatile chemicals in an aquifer like this, they emit vapor through subsurface soils into the overlying buildings and in the atmosphere around the buildings. And Phoenix is very much on the map now, the EPA map, because it hosts several sites like that which show a very dangerous level of vapor intrusion above some of these plumes. So by contrast with South Phoenix and with these inner ring suburbs, it is to the populations in the affluent northern reaches that most of the technical green innovations are being marketed. The solar technologies, the hybrid cars, the low impact landscaping, the green building techniques, and so on and so forth. All of them adding to the range of eco options already available to affluent residents, sort of making them the environmental equivalent of new apps for their iPhones. And this is just a residential compound in Paradise Valley, which is one of these northern, very affluent northern communities. The question is, how do we prevent areas like this turning into eco-enclaves, hoarding resources and knowledge about resilience from others? Either the green wave has to lift all boats, or else we will find ourselves with a very dismal lifeboat ethic, which was first proposed by the ecologist Garrett Hardin, whereby those not already on board are left behind. A similar lesson applied to the other flashpoints around which I broke down my research: the urban growth machine, downtown revitalization, water management, solar energy, and immigration policy. And I'll just say something briefly about each of them. The urban growth machine, this was the fastest growing post-war metropolis in the US, and so residents' concerns about the environmental costs of urban sprawl, as you can imagine, have multiplied. Typically, however, the anxieties have revolved around things like the toll on non-renewable water supplies, the impact on air quality of commuting patterns, and the encroachment on fragile desert ecosystems. By contrast, the steady transfer of resources, amenities, and wealth away from the center city to the suburbs and satellite cities of Greater Phoenix have attracted much less attention as environmental concerns. Generally don't register as environmental concerns, but they should do, because it's clear that planning, taxation, and energy policies have favored low-density suburban life that condemned inner-city residents to neighborhoods that are now food deserts, far removed from decent employment and amenity centers. Phoenix is a leading city in the phenomenon of job sprawl, for example. The inner-city residents are much further away from decent jobs than they are in other cities. One of the regional sustainability solutions currently on offer is green modifications to upscale master plan communities on the urban fringe. And so just before the housing crash, we saw the construction of higher density new urbanist style developments on the fringe, like Verado. This is an image from one of them. Verado sits out near the White Tank Mountains, for those of you who know the region. It's a classic leapfrog community that's 25 miles from downtown Phoenix. And there were similar plans for several large new cities in the southeastern quadrant. These new, slightly modified green master plan communities will do little to reduce the region's overall carbon footprint, and are likely to enlarge it if they succeed in giving the growth machine a new lease of life. By contrast, a concerted program of equity-minded green investment in the hundreds of vacant lots that dot central urban areas would transform and humanize the character of a metropolis which is, currently in the deepest financial hole of any large U.S. city. One of the first things you notice when you visit Phoenix, center city Phoenix, is the extraordinary number of vacant lots, not unlike Detroit to some degree, except that the land is very valuable. Unlike in Detroit, the value of these lots is very high. So downtown revitalization, for most urban planners and quality of life advocates, downtown revitalization is a preferred antidote to sprawl. And this certainly has not bypassed Phoenix. There's been a battle over the development of downtown Phoenix, or the revitalization of downtown Phoenix. And I found that artist communities had played a role there that was slightly different from the one they've tended to play in other cities as involuntary agents of gentrification. They were contending with developers bent on refurbishing downtown for a new money class, but the artists that I focused on transformed themselves into urban activists or urban advocates. They learned a good deal about urban planning for themselves, and they produced a blueprint for municipal policies that favored a sustainable downtown, what they called a sustainable downtown, featuring income diversity, affordable housing, changes in zoning and fine-grained planning, and so on and so forth. Things that were quite the opposite of what the big dog developers were planning for downtown. So they were relatively successful in getting heard at City Hall, largely because they were well educated, and they were Anglo, and they predominantly Anglo, and they had a lot of symbolic capital to wield. So they got a hearing at City Hall and have been quite successful. Their success was not matched by their neighbors, low-income residents of many of the downtown areas, many of whom are still being chased out of town by the crackdown on immigrants. And unless the needs of those residual residents are adopted as priorities, the resulting destabilization of their neighborhoods will leave them almost as vulnerable as the victims of subprime lending. And in a city like Phoenix, where you had to drive until you qualified for a mortgage loan in the housing boom, the victims of subprime lending tend to be in the foreclosure belts on the urban fringe. That's where you find them, in the outer rings. Here's a shot of what I think of as four ecologies of downtown Phoenix. Very starkly delineated. There's a vacant lot here. This is the colorful artists community zone. This is loft-like condos that were built just at the peak of the housing boom. And behind are the business hotels and banks of the central business district. Some advertising for these edgy, urban, hip, loft-like condos, most of them empty still at this point. Water, I'll be very brief about water because consciousness about water scarcity is of course inherent in the far western lifestyle. The Southwest has been on a drought watch for 13 years now and counting. And so the cost of bringing in the next bucket of water is certain to escalate. If and when water shortages begin to show up, it will be the capacity of crosstown cooperation, capacity of crosstown communities to share their supplies with each other, which will be a telling test of resilience and mutual aid. And the Hohokam who survived quite admirably for 1,000 years. The Hohokam faced a similar test of regional cooperation and ultimately failed, joining that long list of riverine civilizations that did not respond very well, sociologically speaking, to the tightening of resources. There's a reconstructed pit house from the Hohokam, late Hohokam period, classic period. Anyway, the evidence suggests that it's not too late to discourage, through taxation and other kinds of pricing, to discourage the growth in the urban periphery of the very populations who will be most hard hit by water shortages, because it's the people on the fringe who will be most hard hit by the water shortages. Again, and I'll just skip over the renewable energy part, because a lot of the research in my book on solar energy is pretty technical. Suffice it to say that central Arizona has some of the best solar exposure in the world. And so fledgling plans to harness the state's most abundant natural resource are really the one major hope of recovery for the economy. But the Arizona legislature, which is one of the most hard right and one of definitely the kookiest in the entire nation, I mean, jaw-droppingly kooky. They're zealously committed to throwing obstacles in the path of renewable energy at a time when, concerted support is most needed. The last object of my investigation was immigration or anti-immigration policy. It's one that doesn't crop up very often in discussions about sustainability or urban sustainability in particular, but it really should do so in my opinion. And it was certainly difficult to ignore or avoid the topic in Arizona during the period I was doing my research there. The state's increasingly harsh anti-immigration laws are certainly spurred by the anxiety of Anglos about losing their demographic and political dominance to the burgeoning Latino population, which is about 40% of Phoenix and 30% of the state at this point. But the inhospitable responses of many of the nativist Anglos are also shaped by what you could call neo-Malthusian fears, stoked up by right-wing anti-immigration groups, fears about population pressure and scarce resources. And one of the things I found was that there is already, I would say, a causal environmental link between Arizona's undocumented migrants and their Anglo tormentors in this region. Climate change is fast drying out northern Mexico, right? It's not something that stops at the border. It's drying out northern Mexico, and so some portion of the border crossers to Arizona can and should already be classed as climate migrants. In effect, the carbon emissions of Phoenix residents are responsible, however indirectly, are responsible for displacing the migrants from their land and their livelihoods in northern Mexico. So if you accept that that causal link exists, what claim should border crossers have? At the very least, they should have a legitimate claim on sanctuary. They may also have their own carbon-conscious version of the retort that was often offered by post-colonials when they first settled in cities like London and Paris, who said, "We are here because you were there." And it might go something like, "We are here because your high-carbon lifestyle has killed our livelihoods," or something more pithy than that, I think. But you get my point. Instead, nativists seem hell-bent on turning the state into the kind of exclusion zone that seems very distinctive to me, at least this is how I think of it, distinctive of resource hoarding. So I concluded that Arizona's bitter fight over immigration is the first real skirmish in the climate wars to come, when the threat of global warming will increasingly be used to shape immigration policies around a vision of affluent nations or regions as heavily fortified resource islands. Here's some of Sheriff Joe Arpaio's advertising in the side of his trucks, inviting the citizenry to become vigilantes. This is a border crossing at Sasabe in southern Arizona. Some of you will know that U.S. federal border policy is designed to funnel border crossers into Arizona. and specifically because the threat of dying in the deserts and mountains of Arizona are supposed to act as a deterrent as part of federal border policy. And so I went down to visit, maybe about 15 months ago, this particular border crossing, and I went with Dan Millis, who's one of the Samaritans in the region in Tucson. He's a Sierra Club operative, and he's one of the so-called Samaritans who, among other things, they leave containers of water in the desert along migrant trails. And Dan was the subject of quite a celebrated trial. A few years ago, he was arrested and charged with littering the desert for leaving these water containers in the desert. And he was exonerated eventually, but it was an interesting trial because the judge would not allow any humanitarian considerations to be entered into the court case. The whole trial revolved around the definition of garbage. You know, what is garbage and what is not. So anyway, when I was down there with Dan, I asked him to show me how easy it was to scale the wall, the border fence, and of course it took him maybe 2 or 3 seconds at the most, because, as they say, humans are the only things that the fence does not stop. But within 2 minutes, we were surrounded by by border patrol trucks and helicopters buzzing overhead, and a lot of very belligerent agents, border agents, threatening us with indefinite detention for aiding and abetting aliens, as they put it. Things did not look very good for a while, until Dan's arresting agent showed up, and he recognized him and realized that Dan was a political hot potato and should not be arrested. So we were free to go that day, luckily, but I don't recommend that you do this if you go down and visit the border, especially, well, just about anywhere, but especially in southern Arizona. So my question about the fortified resource island, is this enclave mentality already at work? Certainly internationally, the ugly side of the debate about carbon emissions is centered on who has the right to go on polluting and which populations are likely to be sacrificed as a result over the course of the next century or so. Are we seeing the same kinds of triage calculations being made locally about which populations are to be protected and which are to be cut loose? Arizona's Latinos could hardly be faulted for believing that they were put on notice about which triage category they're destined for. And the trauma and stigma of their criminalization under the new laws may well endure for generations. This guarantee that race relations will be toxic for many years to come does not augur well for social sustainability. And so the lesson offered by Arizona's treatment of immigration, I think, will be instructive to other regions, as and when climate migration escalates, as it's almost sure to do. We're already 200 million climate migrants in the world, by some estimates, many more than refugees from wars, and that number is going to increase exponentially over the next few decades. I want to end on a slightly more optimistic note. One of the things I develop in the book is a study of case study of the Gila River Indian community, which is here. This is a 360,000 acre chunk of land, and largely undeveloped, and it sits in the growth path of the megapolitan Sun Corridor. And the Akimel O'odham, or Pima Indians, who claim descent from the Hohokam, are the majority tribal group on the reservation. And they were oasis farmers in the 19th century, very successful oasis farmers in the 19th century, and they're particularly lionized in the Anglo annals of Indian history because they helped, they rescued and helped to provision a lot of emigrants, gold rush emigrants who were heading to California along the Gila Trail. in the 19th century. So they were, you know, good Indians as opposed to the bad Indians in the region who were the Apache. What happened subsequently, however, is less lionized. Mormon settlers who settled upriver on the Gila increasingly cut off the water supply, and the flow of the Gila River basically disappeared for most of the year. As a result, the Pima were rendered destitute, their health declined rapidly, and today this small tribal population hosts the highest incidence of adult onset diabetes in the world. So it's very closely scrutinized by medical researchers. The population never gave up its struggle in the courts to regain their water, and in 2004 they won the largest Indian water settlement in the U.S. As a result, and this was a long struggle for environmental justice, at least that's what I would call it. We came to a kind of triumphant conclusion in 2004. And the settlement gave them the rights to 25% of the state's water allocation from the Colorado River, you know, which is a huge chunk of water and a lot of power in the region, as you can imagine. And the Gila River Indian community intends to use the water rights to restore as much as 150,000 acres of farmland. So delivering justice to the Pima means that a large portion of the region's available water resources will now be sequestered from the urban growth machine. Instead of supplying a new generation of low-density tract housing, the water can now be used to produce healthy local food for the population of central Arizona. And if non-industrial agriculture prevails on the reservation, which is by no means a foregone conclusion, there's already a struggle over that, the result will be a double win for carbon reduction. So I conclude that surely this is how a green polity ought to act, redressing the claims of those who have been aggrieved, and doing it in a way that extends benefits in the long term to everyone. And I'll just repeat that because it's a kind of formula. Surely this is how a green polity ought to act, redressing the claims of those who have been aggrieved, and doing it in a way that extends long-term benefits for everyone, and not just the population who's been aggrieved. If all responses to environmental justice were able to follow suit, then I think it would be a welcome model or formula for moving forward. The Gila River example is unlikely to be replicated in other places. It's a very unique case study. But I think the guiding spirit of the formula is a sound one. What if the key to sustainability lies in innovating healthy pathways out of poverty for populations at risk, rather than marketing green gizmos to folks who already have many options to choose from? I don't think these are mutually exclusive options, but the lessons I took away from my research convinced me of the pressing need for clear alternatives to the eco-apartheid syndrome that afflicts Phoenix and so many other cities. Proponents of green capitalism currently promote the view that a post-fossil economy can be sufficiently driven by the market segment known as LOHAS, which is Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability. It's a $500 billion global market, covering almost about 20% of all adult consumers in OECD countries. LOHAS evangelists more or less assume that reforming the high carbon consumption of folks in this market segment will be enough to stave off the scenarios of eco-collapse. Problem, and Van Jones points this out, the problem is a problem with math. The carbon savings to be gotten out of this 20% can't possibly outweigh the commercial neglect of the other 80%. And at the global level, the climate justice movement has also challenged green capitalism's assumption that advanced economies like ours can solve the climate problem on their own through focusing on this LOHAS, this upmarket LOHAS segment of production and consumption. So building a low-carbon economy in cities by targeting only the low-house demographic will probably end up doing little more than adding a green gloss to patterns of chronic inequality. Let me end with two images. This first one, which I had up at the beginning of the lecture, excuse me, is actually a piece of earth art, wonderful piece of earth art. I think it was made at the height of the housing boom by Matthew Moore. Currently has a big retrospective at the Phoenix Art Museum. Moore grew up in a family farm on the urban fringe of the West Valley, and like all farms that are near the urban fringe, it was destined to be gobbled up for development. And so what he did was he literally grew a model of the first subdivision that would be built on the farm. And this is a field in which the houses are grown from sorghum and the roads are black-bearded wheat. And it's a kind of ambivalent commentary on the formula at the heart of the growth machine, which is the ready conversion of farmland into low-density tract housing. So, according to him, his art is as popular among developers as it is among anti-sprawl advocates. So, go figure. And this last image is an image of something called the Phoenix Burn, which is an annual art world ritual. Because it involves burning, it's unapproved by City Hall, so it takes place at an undisclosed location, usually at the end of March. It's probably recently. An elaborately hand-carved phoenix is put to the flame by an anarchist-style art collective known as Thought Crime. Interesting group who were chased out of neighboring Tempe by the police, who labeled them as Satanists because they practice the art of fire performance. And for them, they insist on the rejuvenating qualities, spiritual qualities of the burning phoenix. And this is quite at odds with the cyclical land economics that are more typically associated with Phoenix, which are, speculate, crash, and burn. Speculate, crash, and burn. Speculate, crash, and burn. We're still in the burn phase, and you'd be hard put to find people who believe, people in the region who believe that the cycle will start up again in anything like the same way as it has done so reliably in a place like Phoenix and so many other Western settlements for the last 100 years or so. So I'll just end there, and thank you.